Today, an absolute speed chess roller coaster, a banger from the Speed Chess Championship 2025 semifinals. On one side, we have the GOAT himself, Magnus Carlsen, 5-time world champion, basically a chess superhero. And on the other side, Denis Lazavik, the underdog ready to shock the world. This is Game 5 of their match, in the lightning-fast 3-minute 1-second increment format. And Denis is about to show the masterclass. Alright, Denis has the white pieces and opens with pawn to d4, a classic. Magnus responds with pawn to e6, signaling he might go for a French defense setup. White continues with pawn to c4, now we're in queen's pawn territory. But Magnus throws a curveball, with pawn to c5, the Benoni defense, spicy. Denis pushes pawn to d5. Magnus takes with pawn on d5. White recaptures pawn takes on d5. Magnus plays pawn to d6, we're in the modern Benoni setup. This opening is super sharp and tactical. White brings out knight to c3. Magnus fianchettos with pawn to g6. Denis continues developing, pawn to e4, claiming the center. Magnus develops his bishop to g7. Denis plays pawn to h3, stopping any kind of business on g4. Magnus plays pawn to a6, preparing queenside expansion. Denis responds pawn to a4 to stop pawn on b5. Magnus develops knight to f6, attacking that e4 pawn. Denis brings out knight to f3, classic development. Magnus castles kingside. Safety first, even in blitz. Okay, now things start cooking. White plays bishop to d3, developing with purpose. Magnus brings his other knight out to d7. Now, Denis castles kingside. The position looks calm, but Magnus has ideas. He plays knight to h5, heading for f4 to pressure White's position. Denis responds bishop to g5. But Magnus plays bishop to f6, forcing the bishop to make a choice. Denis retreats his bishop to e3. And Magnus activates his rook to e8. Putting pressure on the e-file. If you made it this far, you clearly love seeing epic chess battles. Hit like, and that subscribe button so you never miss another crazy game analysis like this one. Denis plays bishop to e2. Magnus expands with pawn to b6. Denis repositions with knight to h2, planning to reroute to g4. Magnus brings his knight back with knight to g7. Now here's where it gets crazy. Denis plays knight to g4. And Magnus makes a huge decision, bishop takes knight on c3. Sacrificing the bishop for activity. Denis recaptures on c3. Magnus slams rook takes pawn on e4 taking material. White plays bishop to d3, and Magnus has to retreat, rook to e8. Was the rook raid worth it? Think about it. Denis plays queen to d2. Magnus solidifies with pawn to f6. Denis activates, rook to e1, pressuring on the e-file. Magnus centralizes beautifully, knight to e5. White strikes with knight to h6 check, forcing Magnus king to move to f8 for safety. Denis plays bishop to f1, which was a mistake. Because Magnus had a chance to sacrifice a bishop. If Denis captures the bishop, then knight forks not 2 pieces, but 3 pieces with queen. However, Magnus brings the rook to a7. Denis pushes pawn to c4, advancing the passed pawn. And Magnus goes for it, bishop takes pawn on h3. Grabbing material. The same idea, still works because Denis missed this idea when he pushed pawn to c4. Denis pushes pawn to a5, Magnus takes pawn on a5. White recaptures rook takes on a5, and Magnus retreats the bishop to c8, which was a blunder. White plays rook takes pawn on c5, sacrificing the rook. Magnus accepts, pawn takes on c5. Okay folks, buckle up because Denis is about to show us a masterclass in attacking endgame. Bishop takes pawn on c5, check. Magnus blocks with rook to e7, both rooks defending. But Denis isn't messing around, he sacrificed his second rook. He's giving up the rook for the knight, to rip open lines. Magnus recaptures, pawn takes on e5. And now. The knockout blow. Queen to g5. Look at this position. The queen is a monster on g5. Magnus king on f8 is in serious danger. The knight on h6 is perfectly placed, the bishop on c5 is aiming at the king, and that queen, chef's kiss. Magnus tries knight to h5, desperately trying to block some lines and trade pieces. But Denis delivers the final blow, queen takes pawn on e5. And Magnus resigns in this position. He saw the mate on the board. Rook is pinned, knight is away. If queen takes the pawn, sacrificing itself for the delayed checkmate, doesn't help. Queen goes to h8, and if queen blocks, no use, it is a checkmate. Bishop and knight dominated the king side. What a game! Even though Magnus won the overall semi-final match and advanced to the finals, this game shows that in speed chess, anything can happen. One miscalculation, 1 second of hesitation, and even the GOAT can fall. What was your favorite moment? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching.